Before I begin, if you've ever lived through betrayal like this, if you've ever had your worth stripped away by someone who promised to protect you, please leave a comment, and subscribe to Voice of Legends. I used to believe that a home was made of walls and vows and shared last names. I believed that if I kept my voice soft and my hands busy and my head down, love would stay. That night taught me how wrong I was. It happened on a Thursday, the kind of ordinary day that lulls you into thinking nothing can shatter it. I remember the smell of burnt onions from dinner and the sound of the washing machine thumping off balance. My son was on the floor with his toy cars, lining them up with the seriousness only children have. I had just folded the last towel when my husband came in, slamming the door so hard the picture frames rattled. He didn't ask how my day was. He didn't look at our child. He stood there with his jaw tight, eyes cold, holding his phone like it was a weapon. He accused me of things I didn't understand at first, of being unfaithful, of embarrassing him, of being that kind of woman. I tried to laugh it off, to reason, to explain. I had nothing to confess because there was nothing to hide. But he wasn't listening. He had already decided who I was. His voice grew louder with every word, and neighbors' lights flicked on across the street as if they could sense what was happening. Then he said it. He said it with a sneer, with the kind of certainty that crushes your chest. "You're a tramp, and your kid will be too." I felt something tear inside me, something that never fully healed back into its original shape. Before I could gather my thoughts, before I could shield my son's ears, my husband grabbed a trash bag from under the sink and started shoving my clothes into it. He dragged the bag to the door and threw it outside like garbage. He opened the door and pointed, "Get out." I remember kneeling down to my son, my hands shaking as I pulled his jacket on. He looked up at me, confused, trusting, unaware that the world he knew had just cracked open. I begged my husband to stop yelling, not for me, but for the child who was shaking in my arms. He laughed. The neighbors were watching now, curtains twitching. I felt stripped, exposed, reduced to a caricature of shame he had invented. I walked out because staying would have broken something worse than my pride. The door slammed behind us, and just like that, my marriage ended on the front lawn. We slept in my car that first night. I parked 2 streets away so no one would see us. I wrapped my coat around my son and tried to make a game of it, telling him we were camping. He asked where Daddy was. I told him Daddy needed some time to cool down. I lied because the truth was too heavy for a 5-year-old to carry. I cried silently in the driver's seat, my forehead resting against the steering wheel, listening to my own breathing so I wouldn't scream. The days that followed blurred together. I called my sister first, then a friend, then another. Some offered sympathy, but no space. Some offered couches with expiration dates. I learned quickly how thin kindness can be when it inconveniences people. I learned how humiliating it feels to ask for help and how dangerous it is to believe you don't deserve it. My husband didn't call. He didn't ask about his child. He changed the locks within a week and sent me a message saying any further contact should be through his lawyer. That word, lawyer, felt like a door slamming inside my chest. I took odd jobs wherever I could, cleaning offices at night, babysitting during the day, folding clothes at a laundromat for cash. I learned how to stretch a bag of rice for a week and how to smile at my son even when my stomach growled. We moved from couch to couch, sometimes staying with people who whispered about me when they thought I couldn't hear. I caught fragments of judgment floating through rooms like dust. She must have done something. Men don't just throw you out. Poor kid. Every word echoed my husband's voice, reminding me of the label he had stamped onto us. On nights after my son fell asleep, I would replay that moment on the lawn, the word tramp burning into my memory. I wondered if it would follow us forever, if it would cling to my child's name in school hallways and playgrounds. I was terrified not just of being poor, but of being seen as less than human. Shame has a way of convincing you that you deserve every hardship that comes your way. I fought that voice daily, sometimes hourly, clinging to the simple truth that I loved my child fiercely, and that had to count for something. There was one night, months in, when I broke down in the bathroom of a diner where I was scrubbing floors after closing. My hands were raw, my back ached, and the mirror showed a woman I barely recognized, eyes dulled by exhaustion, shoulders permanently hunched. I whispered to my reflection, "You are not what he said." It felt ridiculous, like pretending a storm wasn't happening while rain soaked you through, but I kept saying it over and over. I said it for me. I said it for my son. Slowly, quietly, things began to shift, not in dramatic ways, not with sudden money or apologies, but with small mercies. A woman who owned a small bakery noticed how carefully I cleaned and offered me regular hours. The smell of bread became a comfort, a promise that something warm could come from hard work. I saved every spare dollar in an envelope hidden in my bag. My son started school, and I watched him make friends, laughing without knowing the weight I carried. He wasn't becoming what my husband had predicted. He was becoming himself, kind, curious, gentle. Still, the past followed me like a shadow. There were nights I lay awake worrying about running into my husband, about the power he still held with his money and his confidence and his ability to rewrite the story. I didn't want revenge. I wanted peace. I wanted to stand in my own skin without flinching. I wanted my son to grow up seeing strength that didn't shout. By the time a year had passed, I had a small apartment of our own. The walls were thin, the furniture mismatched, but it was ours. I hung my son's drawings on the fridge like they were masterpieces. I paid the rent on time with money I earned myself. Sometimes, when the apartment was quiet, I would sit on the floor and let the silence settle. It felt different now, not empty, but earned. I didn't know then that life was about to test me one more time, that closure doesn't always come when you ask for it, but when you're finally strong enough to face it. I didn't plan to see him again. In my mind, my husband belonged to a chapter that had already closed, dog-eared and painful, but finished. I had built routines that kept me safe from old memories. Wake up before dawn, pack my son's lunch, walk him to school, head to the bakery, come home tired but proud. Life had become something manageable, something quiet, and quiet felt like victory. But life has a way of circling back when you least expect it, not to punish you, but to measure how far you've come. The first time his name resurfaced was through a letter slipped under my door. The envelope was thick, official, and made my hands tremble before I even opened it. It was about finalizing paperwork, about assets I didn't know still existed, about a meeting that required my presence. Reading his name printed so neatly brought back the sound of his voice shouting, the heat of humiliation on my face. For a moment, I considered ignoring it, letting lawyers handle everything. But something inside me resisted that instinct to hide. I realized I was tired of running, tired of shaping my life around fear. That week was heavy. I barely slept, my mind cycling through imagined encounters. I worried about seeing him look at me the way he used to, like I was something he regretted owning. I worried about my son, about whether he would sense my anxiety. Children always do. The night before the meeting, my son asked me why I was quiet. I told him sometimes grown-ups have old things to finish. He nodded, accepting that answer the way only children can, and hugged me tight. That hug grounded me more than any pep talk could have. The meeting was set at a small office downtown. I arrived early, dressed simply, deliberately. No makeup to impress, no clothes to disguise where I came from. Just clean lines, steady hands, and a heart pounding in my chest. When he walked in, I almost didn't recognize him. He looked older, heavier somehow, as if the confidence he wore like armor had started to rust. He avoided my eyes at first, focused on his phone, on anything but me. For a fleeting second, I felt sorry for him, and that surprised me more than anger would have. When our eyes finally met, the room shifted. I didn't see the man who had thrown us out. I saw someone smaller, someone uncertain. He glanced at my hands, maybe looking for signs of desperation, for proof that I had failed. There was none. I sat up straight, spoke calmly, answered questions with clarity. I noticed how often he interrupted the lawyer, but never me, as if unsure how to handle the version of me that sat there unbroken. At one point, he scoffed under his breath, a familiar sound. He muttered something about how things worked out for me. I looked at him then, really looked, and said quietly that nothing had worked out for me. I had worked. I had scrubbed floors, missed sleep, swallowed pride, and held my child through nightmares. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I simply stated facts. The room fell silent. He shifted in his chair, uncomfortable, exposed by the calm he couldn't provoke into drama. After the meeting, as I gathered my papers, he asked if we could talk privately. My instinct was to refuse, but I remembered why I came. Closure doesn't mean comfort. It means honesty. We stepped outside into the afternoon light. Cars passed, people hurried by, the world moving on as if this moment wasn't monumental for me. He cleared his throat and said he hadn't expected me to bounce back. There it was, the measure he used for my worth. I told him I didn't bounce back. I rebuilt, brick by brick, alone. He asked about our son. It was the first time he had said his name in a year. I told him our child was doing well, that he loved school, that he was kind and curious. I didn't offer photos. I didn't invite involvement. I simply spoke the truth. He nodded, eyes downcast, and said he had been angry, stressed, ashamed, excuses wrapped in softer language. I listened without interrupting, without validating. When he finished, I said something I had rehearsed in my head countless times, but never believed I would say out loud. I told him that his words had hurt us, but they hadn't defined us, that his cruelty had not become our destiny. He didn't apologize the way movies teach you to expect. There were no tears, no dramatic confessions, just a quiet acknowledgement that maybe he had been wrong, that maybe he had underestimated me. That word, underestimated, felt like a release. I realized then that I didn't need him to understand fully. I just needed him to see me as human. And he did, if only for a moment. I walked away from that meeting lighter than I arrived, not because everything was resolved, but because I had stood in my truth without shrinking. I went home and cooked dinner with my son, listening to him chatter about his day. I watched him eat, carefree, unaware of the significance of what I had done. That was okay. The work we do to protect our children is often invisible to them, and that's the point. In the weeks that followed, something subtle but profound changed inside me. I stopped replaying the night we were kicked out. The memory lost its sharp edges. It became a reference point, not a wound. I started to dream again, small dreams at first. Taking a class, saving for a better place, teaching my son that love doesn't come with conditions. I noticed how confident he was becoming, how easily he made friends, how quick he was to comfort others. Every time he showed kindness, I felt a quiet victory. This was the future my husband said was impossible. One afternoon, my son came home upset because another child called him a name. My heart clenched, old fears resurfacing. I knelt down and asked him how it made him feel. He said it hurt, but then he shrugged and said the kid must be having a bad day. I stared at him, stunned. In that moment, I understood the true power of what we had survived. He was learning empathy, not bitterness, strength, not cruelty. I tucked him into bed that night and sat beside him longer than usual, watching his chest rise and fall. I thought about all the nights I cried silently so he wouldn't hear, all the times I doubted myself, and I realized that resilience isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It grows quietly in kitchens and laundromats and small apartments filled with love. I didn't go back to my husband for revenge. I went back to reclaim my story, to prove to myself that I was never what he said. And as I turned off the light and closed my son's door, I felt something close to peace settle in my bones, the kind that comes not from winning, but from becoming whole. The months after that meeting unfolded with the steadiness I wasn't used to trusting. For so long, chaos had been my normal, the calm felt suspicious, like the quiet before another storm. I kept waiting for something to go wrong, for the ground to shift under my feet again. But instead, life continued in small, dependable ways. My son woke up every morning asking what was for breakfast. I tied my apron at the bakery and kneaded dough until my arms ached in a good way. Bills were paid, shoes were replaced before holes formed, and laughter slowly returned to our evenings. Still, the emotional debris from my marriage didn't disappear overnight. Some wounds don't bleed anymore, but they ache when the weather changes. There were days when a customer's sharp tone or a stranger's judgmental glance sent me spiraling back into that front lawn. On those days, I reminded myself of the woman I had become, not the one I had been forced to play. Healing, I learned, isn't about forgetting. It's about choosing not to live inside the memory. One afternoon, as I was wiping down the counter at the bakery, my boss pulled me aside. She was a woman who spoke plainly, who didn't waste words on flattery. She told me she had noticed how customers trusted me, how I remembered their names, their orders, their stories. She said she wanted to train me to manage the morning shift. The offer caught me off guard. For a moment, my instinct was to say I wasn't ready, that someone like me shouldn't be in charge. That voice sounded suspiciously like my husband's. I swallowed and said yes. The promotion didn't just change my paycheck, it changed how I saw myself. I started walking a little straighter, speaking a little firmer. I learned how to lead without barking orders, how to listen, how to solve problems calmly. Every skill I honed felt like proof that I wasn't broken. I was growing. At home, my son noticed the difference before I did. He started telling people proudly that his mom was in charge of the bread. The way he said it, with awe and certainty, filled a place in my chest that had been hollow for years. We established rituals that anchored us, Friday night dinners where we cooked together, even if it was just pasta and sauce from a jar, Saturday mornings at the park where I watched him climb and run and negotiate friendships, Sunday afternoons spent drawing or reading, the apartment filled with comfortable silence. These moments didn't look impressive from the outside, but they were rich with safety. They were the opposite of the life I had fled. There were still reminders of my past marriage, of course, legal documents, occasional messages routed through lawyers, whispers from mutual acquaintances who thought I would want updates. I didn't. I learned to set boundaries without guilt. I wasn't obligated to carry news of a man who had chosen cruelty over compassion. That realization was freeing in a way I hadn't anticipated. It wasn't anger that released me, it was indifference. One evening, after my son was asleep, I sat at the small kitchen table and looked around our apartment. The mismatched chairs, the thrift store lamp, the slightly crooked picture frames. Each item told a story of survival. I thought about how close I had come to believing my husband's words, how easily I could have internalized them and let them shape my child's future. The thought sent a chill through me. Words have power, especially when spoken by someone you trust, but they only win if you let them. I decided then to start writing, just for myself at first. I wrote about the night we were kicked out, about sleeping in the car, about the shame and fear and stubborn hope that refused to die. Putting it on paper felt like pulling splinters from my skin, painful but necessary. Sometimes I cried as I wrote. Sometimes I laughed at the absurdity of how far we'd come. I didn't know if anyone would ever read it, but the act of telling my story on my own terms was healing. Around that time, my son came home with a school assignment that asked parents to write a short letter about their child. I stared at the blank page longer than I expected. How do you summarize a person who saved you without knowing it? I wrote about his kindness, his curiosity, his resilience. I wrote about how he taught me to keep going when I wanted to give up. When he read it, his eyes widened. He asked if it was really about him. I said yes. He hugged me hard and whispered that he loved me. In that moment, every sacrifice felt worth it. I ran into my ex-husband once more that year, unexpectedly, at a grocery store. He was with someone new. I was with my son. Our eyes met briefly across the produce aisle. There was no confrontation, no words exchanged, just recognition. I felt no urge to hide or explain. I placed apples in my cart and moved on. Later, I realized that was my final closure, not a conversation, but the absence of reaction, the knowledge that his presence no longer dictated my emotional weather. As the year drew to a close, I reflected on the person I had been when this journey began. I had been afraid, ashamed, convinced I had failed. Now I saw a woman who had survived emotional abuse, who had protected her child, who had rebuilt a life with integrity. I wasn't rich, I wasn't celebrated, but I was whole. And wholeness, I discovered, is its own kind of wealth. The words my husband had thrown at us no longer echoed in my mind. They had been replaced by quieter truths, that love teaches dignity, that children learn who they are by watching how you treat yourself, that being underestimated can be a strange kind of gift. It gives you room to grow without an audience. On the anniversary of the night we were kicked out, I lit a candle after my son went to bed. I didn't do it to mourn. I did it to honor the woman I had been and the one I had become. I whispered a promise into the quiet apartment to myself and to my child that no one would ever define us again. And as the flame flickered steadily, I knew that promise was already being kept. The second year of our new life didn't arrive with fireworks or grand announcements. It came softly, like most real changes do, slipping into our days without asking permission. I stopped counting time by how long it had been since the night we were kicked out and started measuring it by milestones I never thought I'd reach. The first time I paid all the bills early. The first time my son invited a friend over without worrying about where we lived. The first time I laughed so hard I forgot for a moment that I had ever been afraid. With stability came reflection. I began to understand just how deeply emotional abuse had shaped my thinking. It wasn't just the shouting or the insults. It was the slow erosion of confidence, the way my needs had been minimized until I believed they didn't matter. I noticed how often I apologized unnecessarily, how quickly I assumed blame. Recognizing these patterns was uncomfortable, but it was also empowering. You can't change what you refuse to see. At the bakery, my responsibilities continued to grow. I trained new employees, handled inventory, and resolved conflicts that once would have sent me into a panic. Each challenge felt like a quiet rebuttal to the man who said I was nothing. My boss trusted me, not because I demanded it, but because I earned it. That trust became a mirror in which I saw myself more clearly, competent, reliable, worthy. My son thrived in ways that amazed me. His teachers spoke of his empathy, how he stood up for classmates who were teased, how he shared without being asked. Hearing that stirred something deep inside me. It was proof that cruelty hadn't seeped into him, that love had done its work. At night, when I tucked him in, he would sometimes ask about his father. The questions were gentle, curious rather than longing. I answered honestly but carefully, choosing words that didn't poison his understanding. I told him his father had his own struggles and that none of what happened was his fault. Protecting my child's heart felt like the most important job I had. There were moments when loneliness crept in, unexpectedly and sharp. Watching other families together at school events or hearing couples laugh in restaurants sometimes triggered a familiar ache. I grieved the life I thought I would have, the partnership that never truly existed. But I also recognized that being alone was safer than being diminished. I learned to sit with that loneliness without rushing to fill it. Solitude, I discovered, could be a teacher. Writing became more than a private outlet. Friends encouraged me to share my story, saying it might help someone else feel less alone. The idea terrified me. Exposing old wounds always does. But I remembered how desperate I had been in those early days, how validating it would have been to hear from someone who survived and rebuilt. So I shared, cautiously at first, in small spaces. The responses were overwhelming, messages from women who recognized themselves in my words, who thanked me for articulating feelings they couldn't name. Each message reinforced the idea that pain, when processed with honesty, can become connection. One evening, as I was reading through comments, my son peeked over my shoulder and asked what I was doing. I told him I was telling our story. He thought for a moment and then said he was proud of me. That simple statement felt like a benediction. It reminded me that the most important audience I had was already watching, already learning. I encountered my ex-husband's family once at a community event. The tension was palpable, old loyalties clashing with new realities. Some avoided my gaze, others offered stiff politeness. I didn't engage beyond courtesy. Their opinions no longer carried weight. I had learned that you don't need everyone to understand you. You just need to understand yourself. As time went on, opportunities I never imagined began to appear. A local community group invited me to speak about resilience. I almost declined, the old fear whispering that I wasn't qualified. But I remembered all the nights I survived without qualifications, armed only with determination. I accepted. Standing at that podium, sharing my journey, I felt a strange mix of vulnerability and strength. I wasn't telling my story to impress. I was telling it to free myself from it. After the talk, a young woman approached me, eyes brimming with tears. She said she was in the middle of leaving an abusive relationship and didn't know if she could make it. I held her hands and told her she could, not because it would be easy, but because she was capable of more than she knew. In that moment, I realized my story had outgrown me. It was doing work in the world, quiet but necessary. At home, my son and I celebrated small victories with enthusiasm. Good grades meant homemade cookies. Hard days meant extra hugs. We talked openly about feelings, about mistakes, about forgiveness that doesn't require reconciliation. I wanted him to grow up knowing that strength and gentleness are not opposites. They can exist together, shaping a life that doesn't repeat old cycles. I no longer defined my success by what I had escaped, but by what I was building. A home rooted in respect, a child raised with empathy, a self that trusted its own voice. The man who once tried to reduce me to an insult had become a footnote in a much larger story. And as I stood in my kitchen one evening, watching my son do his homework at the table we bought secondhand, I felt a profound sense of gratitude, not for the pain, but for the growth it forced upon me. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, that uncertainty didn't scare me. It felt open, full of possibility. And I was ready to meet it, not as someone who had been discarded, but as someone who had chosen herself and her child again and again. By the third year after we were forced out, life no longer felt like something I was surviving. It felt like something I was actively shaping. That distinction mattered more than I realized at first. Survival is reactive. It keeps you looking over your shoulder, bracing for impact. Shaping a life, though, requires intention. It asks you to imagine a future and believe you're allowed to step into it. I started by doing something small but symbolic. I replaced the envelope where I used to stash emergency cash with a proper savings account. The first deposit wasn't much, but it represented trust in myself, in consistency, in tomorrow. I remember standing at the bank counter, signing my name, feeling a quiet pride settle in my chest. No one clapped, no one noticed, but I did, and that was enough. My son noticed changes before I verbalized them. He asked why I smiled more, why I hummed while cooking, why I didn't jump every time the phone rang. Children are keen observers of emotional weather. I told him that sometimes when you work very hard for a long time, your heart finally gets to rest. He seemed satisfied with that explanation and went back to building something elaborate out of blocks. Watching him create without fear of it being knocked down felt like a metaphor I didn't need to explain. There was a moment, one afternoon at the bakery, when everything I had been carrying crystallized. A customer grew angry over a minor mistake and raised his voice at me. In the past, that would have reduced me to silence, my body bracing for humiliation. Instead, I calmly corrected the issue, set a boundary, and continued with my work. After he left, one of my coworkers whispered that she admired how I handled it. I shrugged it off at the time, but later, alone, I cried. Not from pain, but from recognition. I was no longer living inside old reflexes. My writing gained traction in unexpected ways. What began as private journaling turned into shared reflections, then invitations to contribute to community newsletters and online spaces. I remained careful, protective of my son's privacy, but honest about the emotional landscape of rebuilding after betrayal. I wrote about shame, about resilience, about how empowerment isn't loud or glamorous. It's waking up and choosing yourself even when no one is watching. Each piece felt like a reclaiming a voice that had once been silenced. People often asked me if I hated my ex-husband. The question surprised me every time. Hate requires energy, and I had spent too much of mine already. What I felt instead was clarity. I could see our marriage for what it was, without romanticizing or demonizing it. He had chosen control over compassion. I had chosen survival over submission. Those choices led us to very different places. My son's relationship with his father remained distant. There were occasional inquiries, tentative gestures that never fully materialized into consistency. I let go of the fantasy that I could fix that for him. Instead, I focused on what I could control, being present, being honest, being stable. I taught my son that love is shown through actions, not promises. That lesson wasn't spoken directly, it was lived daily. One evening, while helping my son with a school project about role models, he surprised me by writing my name. I asked him gently why. He said because I didn't give up and because I always told the truth even when it was hard. My throat tightened. Children don't flatter, they observe. His words felt like a mirror reflecting back the woman I had worked so hard to become. There were still hard days, days when money felt tight, when exhaustion crept in, when the weight of sole responsibility pressed down on me. But those days no longer defined me. They were chapters, not conclusions. I had learned to ask for help without shame, to rest without guilt, to say no without apology. These skills, I realized, were not luxuries. They were survival tools refined into wisdom. At a small gathering one night, someone introduced me as inspiring. The label made me uncomfortable. Inspiration felt distant, polished, unrelatable. I wasn't extraordinary. I was ordinary and persistent. I corrected them gently, saying I was just someone who kept going. Later, driving home, I thought about how many women never hear that it's enough to keep going, that you don't need to be flawless or fearless to rebuild. You just need to be willing. The memory of being thrown out never fully vanished. It didn't need to. It served as a reminder of how quickly life can change and how resilient the human spirit can be when love is at stake. I no longer replayed the insult my husband hurled at us. It had lost its power, stripped of belief. Words only wound when you let them live rent-free in your identity. I had evicted them. As I tucked my son into bed one night, he asked what he wanted to be when he grew up. I laughed, caught off guard. I told him I wanted to be peaceful. He smiled sleepily and said, I already was. Sitting there in the dim light, listening to his steady breathing, I felt a deep certainty settle in me. Whatever the future held, we would face it together, grounded in truth, strengthened by love. And in that quiet room, I finally understood the lesson that had taken years to learn. Being underestimated doesn't destroy you. It frees you to become everything you were never allowed to be. The more peaceful my life became, the more I understood how chaos had once disguised itself as normal. I noticed it in subtle ways, like how my body no longer tensed when a door slammed, or how my thoughts didn't immediately race to worst-case scenarios when something went wrong. Peace, I learned, isn't loud happiness. It's the absence of constant fear. It's waking up without dread sitting on your chest. It's trusting that today doesn't have to hurt just because yesterday did. My son was growing quickly, not just in height, but in awareness. He began asking deeper questions about fairness, about why some people are mean, about why families look different. I answered him honestly, without bitterness, choosing language that gave him understanding without burdening him with adult pain. I told him that people sometimes hurt others because they don't know how to handle their own feelings. I told him that kindness is a choice, even when it's hard. Watching him absorb these lessons reminded me that healing isn't something we do alone, it's something we pass forward. One afternoon, while cleaning out a drawer, I found the last trash bag I had packed that night we were kicked out. I had kept it, not intentionally, but because moving from place to place doesn't allow for much sorting. Inside were clothes I no longer wore, a cracked compact mirror, and a folded receipt from a gas station near where we slept in the car. My hands shook as I held it. For a moment I was back there, exhausted and terrified. Then I looked around my apartment at the solid walls, the framed drawings, the life we had built. I threw the bag away, not ceremoniously, simply, finally. At work, my boss began talking to me about the possibility of partnership down the line. The word echoed in my mind long after she said it. Partnership, shared responsibility, mutual respect. It struck me how different it felt from marriage. There was no demand for obedience, no expectation of silence, just recognition of effort and trust. I didn't rush into the idea. I had learned that growth doesn't need to be hurried to be real. Around that time, I was invited to speak again, this time at a small support group for single parents. Standing in that circle, looking at faces etched with exhaustion and hope, I felt an unexpected vulnerability. These people didn't need inspiration, they needed validation. I told them about the nights I cried quietly so my son wouldn't hear, about the shame that nearly swallowed me, about how survival sometimes looks like getting through the day without breaking. Heads nodded, tears fell. In that shared space, I felt the power of truth told without polish. After the meeting, a man approached me, not romantically, but with gratitude. He said he had never heard a woman talk about strength without aggression, about resilience without bitterness. His words stayed with me. I realized that my story wasn't about proving anyone wrong. It was about redefining what strength looks like. Not dominance, not revenge, endurance paired with compassion. My relationship with myself continued to deepen. I started therapy, not because I was falling apart, but because I wanted to understand myself better. I unpacked years of minimizing my needs, of equating love with sacrifice. Therapy taught me that boundaries are not walls, they are doors with locks. You decide who gets access. That lesson alone reshaped every relationship in my life. There were moments when memories resurfaced unexpectedly, a certain cologne in an elevator, a tone of voice that echoed the past. But instead of spiraling, I paused. I breathed. I reminded myself where I was, who I had become. Trauma doesn't vanish just because time passes. It softens when you meet it with awareness rather than fear. One evening, my son asked if we could invite his friend's family over for dinner. The request startled me. Hosting felt like a declaration of belonging I wasn't sure I was ready to make, but I agreed. That night, our small apartment filled with conversation and laughter. I watched my son navigate the space confidently, offering snacks, showing off his room. When everyone left, he hugged me and said it was the best night ever. I stood in the quiet afterward, overwhelmed with gratitude. This was home, not because of its size, but because of the safety it held. I thought less and less about my ex-husband. When I did, it was with a distant clarity. I no longer wondered if he regretted his actions or understood their impact. His understanding was no longer required for my peace. That realization felt like a final untying of knots I hadn't known were still there. As the years stacked gently behind me, I recognized that my life had become something I once prayed for in fragments: stability, respect, joy without fear. None of it came quickly, none of it came easily, but it came honestly. And honesty, I learned, is the foundation of any life worth living. One night, as I lay in bed listening to my son breathe in the next room, I thought about the words that once threatened to define us. "You're a tramp and your kid will be too." I almost laughed at how absurd they sounded now, not because they hadn't hurt, but because they had failed. They had not predicted our future. Love had. I closed my eyes with a sense of quiet triumph, not the kind that needs witnesses, but the kind that settles deep in your bones. We were not what he said. We were what we chose to become. Time has a way of revealing what truly matters once the noise fades. By the 4th year, my life had taken on a rhythm that felt both ordinary and sacred. Ordinary because it was built from routines, school mornings, work days, grocery lists. Sacred because every routine existed only because we survived. I didn't take that for granted. I couldn't. Each calm day felt like a quiet rebellion against the chaos that once ruled us. My son entered a new phase of growing up, one that brought curiosity mixed with independence. He wanted to do things himself, to walk a little ahead of me instead of holding my hand. At first, that scared me. For so long, protecting him had been my purpose. Letting go, even in small ways, felt like standing at the edge of a cliff. But I reminded myself that raising a child isn't about keeping them close forever. It's about teaching them how to stand confidently when they step away. One afternoon, he came home upset after a classmate mocked his shoes. They weren't brand new, and kids can sense difference like blood in the water. My heart clenched, old fears rushing back. I asked him what he did. He said he told the boy he liked his shoes, and that was enough. I stared at him, stunned. He didn't lash out. He didn't shrink. He stayed himself. That night I cried quietly in the bathroom, overwhelmed by pride and relief. He was growing into someone strong in ways I couldn't have taught directly. He learned it by watching resilience lived, not preached. At work, the partnership my boss once mentioned became real. Papers were signed, responsibilities increased. I now had a stake in something I helped build. The sense of ownership wasn't just financial, it was emotional. I belonged there. No one could take that away from me. Standing in the bakery early one morning, watching the sun rise through the windows while bread baked in the ovens, I felt grounded. This place, these people, this life, it was mine. With stability came space for reflection about love. Friends gently asked if I was dating again. The idea no longer terrified me, but it didn't excite me either. I wasn't opposed to love, I just refused to rush toward it to fill a void. I wanted connection that added to my life, not something that demanded I disappear inside it. That clarity felt like growth. It meant I trusted myself enough to wait. My writing continued, evolving from survival stories into reflections on boundaries, self-worth, and healing after emotional abuse. I received messages from people across different backgrounds, all resonating with the same themes. Pain may look different, but dignity is universal. Each message reinforced my belief that stories matter, especially the quiet ones that don't end in dramatic revenge, but in steady transformation. There was a moment when my past attempted one final intrusion. A message arrived from my ex-husband, brief and awkward. He said he had been thinking about things and hoped we were okay. I stared at the screen longer than necessary. The old version of me would have overanalyzed every word, searching for meaning or validation. The woman I had become read it plainly. I replied politely, briefly, and without emotion. Yes, we were okay. More than okay. Then I put the phone down and went back to making dinner. That was the difference. My son noticed my calm response and asked who I was texting. I told him honestly. He nodded and asked what was for dinner. That was it. No drama, no questions. Children sense when something no longer holds power. In that moment, I understood that closure doesn't always come from conversations. Sometimes it comes from realizing you no longer need them. As years layered gently upon one another, I reflected on the woman I had been when this story began. She was frightened, ashamed, convinced her life had ended. If I could speak to her now, I wouldn't tell her everything would be easy. I would tell her she would become someone she respected, that her child would thrive, that the words meant to destroy her would become fuel for a life built on truth. One evening, my son asked if I ever felt sad about how things turned out. I thought carefully before answering. I told him I felt sad about how things began, but grateful for where they led. He considered that and smiled. He said sometimes the long way teaches you more. I laughed softly, marveling at his wisdom. He was right. That night, after he fell asleep, I stood by the window and looked out at the quiet street below. The world felt vast and open, no longer threatening. I wasn't waiting for permission to exist. I wasn't defined by a man's anger or society's judgment. I was defined by the life I chose to build day after day with patience and integrity. The insult that once haunted me had lost its meaning entirely. It was no longer a scar. It was a reminder of how wrong someone can be when they underestimate the power of love and perseverance. My child was not what he said. I was not what he said. We were proof that dignity grows where cruelty fails. And as I turned away from the window and prepared for another ordinary, precious day, I knew this story wasn't just about survival. It was about becoming whole, becoming free. There is a moment in healing when you realize you're no longer telling yourself the story to survive it, but to understand it. I didn't notice when that shift happened at first. It came quietly, disguised as normalcy. I stopped flinching when the past brushed up against me. I stopped bracing myself for disaster. I began to trust the steadiness of my days, the predictability that once felt foreign and fragile. My son was older now, tall enough that I had to look up slightly when he hugged me. His voice had deepened just enough to remind me that time was moving forward whether I was ready or not. Watching him grow filled me with pride and a soft ache. Every stage of his life felt like both an arrival and a farewell. I learned to savor moments instead of clinging to them. One afternoon, while helping him with homework, he asked a question that stopped me mid-sentence. He wanted to know why some people try to make others feel small. The question was innocent, curious, but it reached back into memories I had worked hard to place gently on a shelf. I took a breath and told him that sometimes people confuse power with worth, that they believe making others smaller will make them feel bigger. He nodded slowly, absorbing the idea. Then he said something that made my chest tighten. He said he never wanted to be that kind of person. I told him he already wasn't. That night, after he went to bed, I sat alone in the living room and thought about how close I had come to raising him in fear instead of freedom, how easily bitterness could have seeped into our conversations, shaping his worldview. I was grateful I had chosen restraint over resentment, not because resentment wouldn't have been justified, but because it would have cost us too much. My life had become full in ways I once thought impossible. The bakery thrived, and with it, my confidence. I was respected, consulted, relied upon. People trusted my judgment. That trust extended beyond work. Friends came to me for advice, for a steady presence. I listened more than I spoke, aware of how powerful it is to feel heard without being fixed. I knew what it was like to be silenced. I never wanted to be the cause of that in someone else's life. There were days when exhaustion still crept in, when the weight of years of responsibility pressed down on me. On those days, I allowed myself rest without judgment. I no longer equated rest with laziness. I understood it as maintenance, as care. Healing had taught me that strength is not endless endurance. It is knowing when to pause. One evening, my son and I sat on the couch watching a movie, his head resting on my shoulder like he used to when he was small. I realized how rare these moments were becoming. Soon he would be too big, too busy, too independent. I wrapped my arm around him and held still, committing the moment to memory. He shifted slightly and smiled without opening his eyes. I didn't need words to know he felt safe. Occasionally, echoes of my former life surfaced in unexpected places. A comment from a stranger, a story someone shared casually. Each time I measured my reaction. The pain was no longer sharp. It was distant, like a sound from another room. I could acknowledge it without being pulled under. That, I realized, was healing. Not erasing the past, but changing its volume. I was invited to speak at a larger gathering, one focused on overcoming adversity. Standing backstage, waiting to be called, I felt the familiar flutter of nerves. Not fear, but respect for the responsibility of telling a story that wasn't just mine anymore. When I spoke, I didn't dramatize the pain. I didn't glorify the struggle. I told the truth plainly, about being thrown out, about carrying shame that wasn't mine, about rebuilding without applause. The room was quiet in a way that told me people were listening with their whole selves. Afterward, a woman approached me with tears in her eyes. She said she had stayed in a harmful situation because she believed leaving would ruin her children. She said my story made her realize that staying might do more damage. I held her hands and told her she wasn't weak for staying and she wouldn't be selfish for leaving. I didn't tell her what to do. I trusted her to find her own timing. That trust felt like a gift I could offer only because I had once needed it myself. At home that night, my son asked how my talk went. I told him it went well. He nodded and said he liked that I helped people. He said it made him feel proud. Pride from a child is different from praise from adults. It's pure, unfiltered. It reached a place in me that no external validation ever could. I sometimes wondered what my ex-husband thought when he heard fragments of my story through others, if he did at all. The thought no longer stirred anger or curiosity. His internal reckoning was not my responsibility. I had learned that forgiveness is not a transaction. It doesn't require participation from both sides. It's a release you grant yourself. As another year edged towards its close, I reflected on the arc of my life, from humiliation to independence, from fear to steadiness, from being defined by someone else's cruelty to defining myself by my own values. I hadn't become hardened, I had become clearer. Clear about what I would tolerate, clear about what I deserved, clear about the kind of world I wanted my child to inherit. One evening, as I prepared dinner, music playing softly in the background, my son walked into the kitchen and hugged me from behind. He said, "Thank you." When I asked for what, he said, "For always being on my side." I turned and hugged him back, holding him close. I told him I always would be. And in that moment, standing in a warm kitchen filled with the scent of food and the sound of a child's laughter, I understood the deepest truth of all. We hadn't just survived what happened to us. We had transformed it. The words meant to curse us had failed. Love had rewritten the ending. There's a quiet confidence that comes from knowing you can lose everything and still stand. I didn't wake up one day suddenly fearless. Fear still visited, just less often, and it no longer stayed long. By now, I recognized it as a messenger rather than a master. It reminded me to be careful, to be thoughtful, but it didn't get to decide how I lived. My son was entering an age where the world began asking him who he wanted to be. Teachers encouraged ambition, friends talked about dreams. I watched him consider possibilities with a seriousness that made me smile. He talked about helping people, about building things, about fairness. Never once did he speak from a place of anger or scarcity. That was when I truly understood how thoroughly the cycle had been broken. He was not shaped by cruelty. He was shaped by consistency. One afternoon, while sorting old paperwork, I came across documents from my marriage, bank statements, legal forms, remnants of a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. I sat on the floor and went through them slowly. There was no rush, no spike of panic, just a strange sense of distance. These papers once held power over me. Now they were just records. I shredded what I no longer needed, not as an act of defiance, but of release. Some things don't deserve space in your future simply because they existed in your past. At work, the bakery expanded, new staff, longer hours, more responsibility. There were stressful days, days when mistakes happened and pressure mounted, but I met those moments with steadiness instead of self-blame. Leadership, I learned, isn't about control, it's about presence, showing up calm when others are overwhelmed, owning mistakes without collapsing under them. These were skills forged in far harsher conditions than a busy morning rush. People sometimes asked me how I stayed soft after everything I'd been through. The question surprised me. Softness had never been my weakness. Silence had been. Compliance had been. Softness, compassion, empathy, patience was what carried me through. I had learned that you can be gentle without being fragile, kind without being naive. The world didn't need more hardened hearts. It needed people who could remain human without surrendering their boundaries. My son and I had developed a habit of long walks in the evening. We talked about school, about friendships, about things that confused him. Sometimes we walked in silence, comfortable and unhurried. On one of those walks, he asked me if I was happy. The question was simple, but it stopped me in my tracks. I thought carefully before answering. I told him yes, not because everything was perfect, but because my life felt honest. He nodded, satisfied, as if that was the best answer I could have given. That night, alone, I reflected on the difference between happiness and peace. Happiness can be fleeting, reactive to circumstance. Peace is steadier. It comes from alignment between who you are and how you live. I had chased happiness once by trying to be everything my husband wanted. I found peace by becoming myself. There was one final encounter with my ex-husband that year, brief and unplanned. We crossed paths at a community event neither of us expected the other to attend. He looked at me, truly looked, and something in his expression shifted. Not regret exactly, recognition. He saw a woman who was not ruined, who was not bitter, who had built a life without him. He nodded slightly. I nodded back. No words were exchanged, none were needed. The power imbalance that once defined us no longer existed. Later that evening, as I replayed the moment in my mind, I realized I felt nothing sharp, no triumph, no anger, just neutrality. That neutrality was my final victory. Indifference born of healing, not avoidance. My writing took on a new tone after that, less about pain, more about perspective. I wrote about how trauma doesn't have to be your identity, how survival can be a chapter without becoming the whole book. I emphasized the importance of redefining success, not as revenge or public vindication, but as living well in quiet ways. The responses continued, steady and heartfelt. People didn't want spectacle, they wanted truth. At home, my son prepared for a school presentation about family. I let him decide how much he wanted to share. When he practiced in front of me, he spoke about teamwork, about learning from challenges, about supporting each other. He didn't mention absence. He didn't mention pain. He spoke from abundance. When he finished, he asked if he did okay. I told him he did more than okay. He told his truth. On the day of the presentation, I sat in the back of the classroom and listened. Watching him speak confidently, watching his classmates listen, I felt a swell of emotion I had to hold back. This was the child who had once clutched me on a cold night in a car. This was the child my husband had dismissed with cruel words. And here he was, secure, thoughtful, unafraid to be seen. That evening, we celebrated with his favorite meal. We laughed, we talked, we lived. There was no grand speech, no acknowledgement of how far we'd come. We didn't need one. Our life spoke for itself. Before bed, my son asked me if people can change. I told him yes, but only when they want to. He asked if everyone changes. I told him no. Some people stay the same, some grow, and some grow apart. He thought about that and said he wanted to be someone who grows. I smiled and told him he already was. As I turned off the light and closed his door, I stood there for a moment listening to the quiet. I thought about the night we were kicked out, about the words meant to curse us. I thought about how those words had followed me, haunted me, and then slowly lost their power. They had not been prophecy, they had been projection. I went to bed that night with a deep sense of completion settling in my chest. Not the end of the story, but the end of its grip on me. Whatever came next would be met with the same truth that carried us this far. We were not defined by what was taken from us. We were defined by what we chose to build. The next year brought changes I hadn't anticipated, subtle ones that reshaped the texture of our lives. My son was now navigating preteen challenges. Friendships became more complicated, homework more demanding, and he began noticing the world in ways I hadn't expected. Watching him grow into his own person filled me with awe and sometimes fear. I wanted to protect him from every sting, every injustice, but I had learned that shielding completely isn't the answer. Resilience comes from small challenges, from learning to face difficulty with support, not avoidance. One afternoon, he came home with a scraped knee and a tear-streaked face. A classmate had shoved him during a game. My first instinct was panic, my body tightening with old reflexes. But I took a deep breath, kneeling to his level. I asked what happened, listened without interrupting, and offered comfort. I let him express his frustration. Then, instead of lecturing, I guided him in problem solving. We came up with a plan for how he could handle similar situations, ways to speak up safely, and how to seek help when he needed it. He listened, nodding thoughtfully. Afterward, he hugged me tightly and whispered, "Thanks for helping me be brave, Mom." His words echoed in me longer than any compliment ever could. Work continued to flourish. The bakery was no longer just a job, it had become a space of influence. I mentored younger employees, teaching them not just skills, but integrity and patience. I shared lessons about how mistakes aren't failures, they're steps in growth. One young woman, new and hesitant, stayed after her shift to tell me that I had inspired her to pursue a small business of her own. I didn't see myself as remarkable, just persistent, yet here I was, shaping someone else's courage. The irony wasn't lost on me. After years of being underestimated, my influence quietly multiplied. Around this time, I received a letter in the mail. It was from my ex-husband. No threats, no excuses, just a formal notification regarding financial matters I had long since anticipated. I set it aside, feeling a calm I never could have mustered before. That same week, a neighbor mentioned seeing him at the local park. My first thought was dread, a flicker of old anxiety, but it was fleeting. I realized I no longer needed to react. Our lives had diverged completely. The woman who had been afraid of his anger was gone. What remained was a mother confident in her child's safety and in her own self-worth. One weekend, I decided to take my son on a short trip, just the two of us. We packed light, brought snacks, and drove to the small lake town he had always wanted to see. The trip was uncomplicated. We swam, hiked, and explored little shops. At night, we lay on a blanket under the stars, sharing our thoughts. He asked me why I seemed so calm and happy now compared to the past. I told him the truth. It wasn't that everything was perfect, it was that I had learned to trust myself, to trust him, and to build a life that reflected what we valued, not what others demanded. He squeezed my hand and said, "I like this life." That trip became a metaphor I carried with me. Life, I realized, is not about chasing perfection or approval. It's about creating experiences where love and safety coexist. Every decision I made for us, from the smallest grocery choice to career opportunities, was now informed by that principle. It was subtle, quiet, but it created depth. Back at home, the school year brought a new challenge. My son wanted to participate in a talent show. He was nervous and self-conscious, unsure if he was good enough. My instinct was to encourage, but not to push. I told him I believed in him, that trying itself was brave, and that no matter what, I was proud. He practiced diligently, stumbled, laughed, and practiced again. On the day of the show, he stepped onto the stage and performed a short skit he had written. The audience clapped, and he beamed. Later, he hugged me and whispered, "I wasn't scared because I knew you believed in me." That was when I truly understood the depth of what we had built together, a foundation not of shelter or wealth, but of unwavering belief. My own life continued to expand beyond the bakery. Invitations to speak at community events grew, and I began to see the impact of my story in ways I hadn't anticipated. Letters from other single mothers poured in, thanking me for articulating truths they had lived but never named. They shared their struggles with abusive partners, with societal judgment, with self-doubt, and each time I wrote back, not with solutions, but with validation, encouragement, and acknowledgement. I had learned that sometimes the greatest gift is simply being heard. Through all this, I never sought revenge against my ex-husband. I didn't need to. Life had given me a victory far more profound than retaliation: dignity, agency, and the ability to raise my child without fear or shame. The years of hardship had taught me that the loudest triumphs are often the quietest. They don't require spectacle. They require persistence. They require love. One evening, as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the living room, my son and I sat together on the floor building a model ship. I watched his hands, carefully placing each piece, his concentration intense. I marveled at how much he had grown, strong, capable, empathetic. And I understood with complete clarity that both of us had become our own versions of unstoppable, not because the world had been kind, but because we refused to be defined by cruelty. That night, after tucking him in, I stood at the window, looking out at the quiet street. Memories of being kicked out still surfaced from time to time, but they no longer carried the sting of shame. Instead, they served as markers of how far we had come. They reminded me that life can be rebuilt, slowly, intentionally, and with love as the foundation. I realized then that closure isn't a dramatic confrontation or a neatly tied apology. Closure is quiet. It's watching your child thrive. It's standing in your own truth. It's living a life that cannot be dictated by past cruelty. And in that moment, I knew with certainty that we were free. The final year of our journey together felt like standing on solid ground after years of walking on ice. By now, my son was older, thoughtful, and surprisingly self-assured. People often commented on how polite and kind he was, never realizing the deep work of love and patience that had gone into shaping his character. I didn't need their recognition. The quiet pride I felt every day was enough. Watching him grow into a person capable of empathy, courage, and resilience was the most profound affirmation I could ever receive. One morning, while helping him get ready for school, he looked at me with wide eyes and asked, "Mom, do you think I'll ever forget what happened to us?" I paused, brushing a stray strand of hair from his face. "No," I said softly, "and you don't have to. Memories are part of who we are, but they don't have to define who we become." He nodded thoughtfully, as if he understood that wisdom in a way only children sometimes do. It was in that moment I realized how far we had come. He would carry our story, but without fear, without shame, without bitterness. Our home had become a sanctuary, not large, not perfect, but ours. Each corner told a story: the crooked picture frames of his artwork, the worn kitchen table where we shared countless meals and conversations, the tiny bookshelf where his favorite books lived. These details weren't just possessions. They were evidence of resilience, of rebuilding, of ordinary victories that mattered more than any grand gesture. I continued my work at the bakery, but now with more authority and confidence. I trained staff, managed the morning rush with precision, and oversaw operations that once would have seemed impossible. And still, the most important work was at home. Parenting isn't a job you clock out of. It's a constant presence, a daily investment in someone else's heart. I carried it gladly, and my son's steady growth reminded me that it had never been wasted. Then, unexpectedly, life brought me face to face with my past in a way I hadn't anticipated. One evening at a community event where I had been invited to speak, I noticed him, my ex-husband, standing across the room. His presence caused a flicker of tension in my chest, but it was brief. I had changed. I no longer flinched at the sight of him. The years had transformed me into someone who could face the source of my pain without being pulled under by it. He approached cautiously, almost shyly, as if he weren't sure I would speak to him. I smiled politely. He swallowed hard and said, "I've been thinking about how wrong I was." No excuses, no blame, just a simple acknowledgement. I nodded. "We've moved on. We're doing well." And we were. That was all that needed to be said. There was no dramatic confrontation, no need for revenge. What mattered was that I had finally reached the point where his acknowledgement, or lack thereof, did not dictate my peace. Walking home with my son that night, I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. We had survived humiliation, poverty, fear, and doubt. We had rebuilt our lives, not for recognition or revenge, but for ourselves. And in the process, I had discovered something vital. Dignity, resilience, and love are not inherited from wealth or status. They are cultivated in the choices we make day after day, in how we treat ourselves and those we love. At home, we celebrated ordinary victories with quiet joy. A good report card, a successful baking experiment, a heartfelt conversation, each one a reminder that life, when lived authentically, carries its own rewards. I had learned that success isn't always loud. It doesn't require public applause. Sometimes it's simply the knowledge that you survived, that you taught your child to stand tall, that you refused to let cruelty define your story. One night, as I tucked my son into bed, he asked if he could sleep with me for a little while, the way he sometimes did when he was younger. I laughed softly and agreed. As he rested against me, I thought about the journey we had endured together. I remembered the nights spent on strangers' couches, the fear, the shame, the loneliness, and I realized how extraordinary it was to have arrived here, not with grand gestures, not with vengeance, but with love and perseverance. I whispered to him, "We made it, and we'll keep making it every day." He murmured sleepily in agreement. I held him for a few more moments, letting the weight of gratitude settle over me. Finally, in the quiet of our home, I understood the moral of our story in its fullest sense. Life will try to define you, to limit you, to place you into a story that isn't yours. Cruelty and judgment can leave scars, but they cannot shape your destiny unless you allow them to. What endures is what you build, the love you nurture, the resilience you model. Children learn not from insults hurled at them, but from the integrity, compassion, and strength of the people who raise them. The woman who had been kicked out, humiliated, and doubted is still a part of me, but she is no longer the one writing the story. The author now is a mother, a survivor, a woman who refused to be defined by anyone else's cruelty. And the ending, though quiet, is powerful. We are whole, we are strong, and we are free. I turned off the light, leaving the room bathed in the soft glow of the night. My son was asleep, and for the first time in a long time, so was the anxiety that had once accompanied every day. I lay in bed, breathing in the calm, and whispered a final promise. No one will ever define us again. And in the silence that followed, I knew that promise was already being kept. The past had taught us lessons, but it no longer had power. Our future, crafted in love, patience, and resilience, was ours entirely. And that, I realized, is the truest form of victory.